What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the woman you loved was a single winter, and you had to survive it with nothing but your own hands and your own word? In 1882, a broke 23-year-old ranch hand named Elias Carter walked up to one of the most powerful men in Montana and asked to court his daughter. He had $14 to his name, a tired horse, a saddle held together by prayers and cracked leather. The old man didn't throw him off the property. He did something far worse. He said yes. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this thing travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the end. This one's worth it. The money sat in his palm like an accusation. Elias Carter counted it 3 times, not because he was confused about the amount, but because he kept hoping the number would change. It never did. $14 and some odd cents, most of it in coins worn so smooth you could barely make out the faces pressed into them. He closed his fist around the coins, felt their cold edges bite into the creases of his palm, and looked out across the land that had swallowed the last 4 years of his life. The Bitterroot Valley stretched out before him in that peculiar October light that Montana saved for its worst moments. Gold and red and impossibly beautiful. The kind of beauty that made a man feel small if he let himself think about it too long. The mountains to the west had already gone white at their tops, which meant winter was maybe 6 weeks out, maybe less. He was 23 years old and broke as a church mouse. His horse, a bay gelding he called Dun on account of his coloring being neither one thing nor another, stood tied to the hitching post outside Beaumont's general store in the small town of Harlow Creek. The animal was 12 years old, which made him ancient by working standards, and his back had developed a slight dip that every saddle seemed to settle into wrong. The saddle itself, a double-rigged Texas style that Elias had bought second-hand in Billings 3 years back, had a repaired cinch ring and a cantle that creaked like a rocking chair on a cold porch. That was his inventory: horse, saddle, $14, and the problem of Lydia Hawthorne. He pushed off the post he'd been leaning against and went inside the store, where the smell of leather and tobacco and dried goods hit him like a familiar hand on the shoulder. Old Beau himself was behind the counter, spectacles low on his nose, penciling numbers into a ledger with the grave attention of a man who understood that small margins were the difference between eating and not. Carter. The old man didn't look up. Mr. Beaumont. Elias set his hat on the counter and ran a hand through his hair, which needed cutting badly and knew it. I need some paper, and maybe an envelope if you've got one to spare. Beaumont set down his pencil and looked at him over the spectacles. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something close to wisdom, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that had made decisions and stuck to them. You writing a letter or a will? Letter. To who, if you don't mind my asking? Elias looked at the floor, then back up. There wasn't much point in lying in a town this size. Lydia Hawthorne. The store went quiet. The only sound was the wind pushing at the front door and a dog barking somewhere down the main street. Beaumont took his spectacles off entirely and folded them shut. Son, he said, and his voice carried the specific gentleness reserved for men about to say something a person doesn't want to hear. You understand who her father is. Yes, sir. Arthur Hawthorne runs 4,000 acres of the best grazing land in this county. He's got 2 ranch hands for every task a normal man does himself. He sits on the school board and the water committee, and half the town comes to him when they need something sorted out. I know who he is. And you're... Beaumont paused, searching for the word. Broke, Elias supplied. I was going to say unestablished. That's a kinder word for the same thing. Elias pulled out his coins and set one on the counter. The paper and envelope, please. Beaumont looked at the coin for a long moment, then reached under the counter and produced both items without charging him. He just slid them across the wood and put his spectacles back on and returned to his ledger, which Elias understood to be the most tactful thing the man could have offered. He wrote the letter standing at the far end of the counter, using a stub of pencil Beaumont left out for customers to mark their orders. He wasn't a gifted writer. He'd had schooling up to about 12 years old when his mother died, and the farm his father ran in eastern Wyoming demanded every able body it could get. But he knew how to be direct, and direct was what the situation seemed to call for. Miss Hawthorne, I've been trying to find the right occasion to say what I mean to say for the better part of 3 months. I don't think the right occasion is coming, so I'm writing it down instead. I would like to call on you, if you are willing, and if your father permits it. I don't have much to offer except that I mean what I say when I say it, and I work hard, and I won't pretend to be something I'm not. I realize that may not be enough, but I thought I'd rather ask than not ask. With respect, Elias Carter. He folded it, sealed the envelope, and addressed it to the Hawthorne Ranch. Then he stood there for a moment with it in his hands, the way a man stands at the edge of something high. "Beaumont," he said, "you heading out toward the Hawthorne place anytime soon?" The old man looked up again. "I've got a delivery for them Thursday. Would you mind?" Beaumont took the letter without a word and set it under his counter. The answer didn't come from Lydia. It came from Arthur Hawthorne himself, delivered by one of his hands. A big, quiet Swede named Olson, who rode into Harlow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon and found Elias mending fence on the Daltrey spread north of town, where he'd been picking up day work since the Colfax outfit let him go in September. Olson sat on his horse and watched Elias work for a moment before speaking. "You Carter?" Elias straightened up, wire cutters in hand. "I am. Mr. Hawthorne wants to see you." No pleasantries, no context, just the fact, delivered like a piece of mail. Elias set down the cutters. "When?" Now would be his preference. He looked at the fence, about 60 feet still needed, then at Olson, then at his own hands, which were cut up from the wire and not especially clean. "Give me a minute," he said. He went to his saddlebag and got out the piece of cloth he used as a rag, wiped his hands as best he could, rolled his sleeves back down, and put on his coat. It wasn't much of a presentation, but it was what he had. They rode in silence most of the way, which suited Elias fine. He wasn't much for making conversation when his mind was occupied, and his mind was very occupied. He was trying to prepare himself for the possibility that this meeting ended with him being told clearly and permanently that he was not welcome anywhere near Lydia Hawthorne. He figured if he could get himself ready for that outcome, anything else would feel like extra. The Hawthorne Ranch appeared as they crested a long rise, and even a man trying to brace himself against intimidation had to pause at the sight of it. The main house was 2 stories of good timber with a covered porch running the full front length. Barns stood solid and well-maintained off to the northeast. Corrals held horses that cost more individually than Elias had made in 2 years combined. The whole operation had the look of something that had been built carefully, over time, by someone who thought long before he acted. A man was sitting on the porch when they rode up. Arthur Hawthorne was 61 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who have spent decades outdoors often do. Not decrepit, just weathered down to something essential. He was lean, with a white mustache and hands that looked like they'd spent 30 years doing actual work before the ranch got big enough to let other men do it instead. He watched Elias ride in with an expression that gave away nothing whatsoever. "Mr. Carter." He didn't stand. "Mr. Hawthorne." Elias dismounted, tied Dunn to the rail, and climbed the porch steps. He didn't wait to be invited up, which later he would think was either the right call or a terrible one. He still wasn't sure. "Sit down," Hawthorne said, gesturing to a chair across from his. Elias sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. A ranch hand moved across the yard below, carrying something. A horse in the far corral kicked once at the fence and settled. The mountains to the west were going orange in the afternoon light. "You wrote my daughter a letter," Hawthorne said. "Yes, sir." "She's read it." "I suspected she might." Something moved at the edge of Hawthorne's expression. Not quite a smile, but its first cousin. "You know what she said when she read it?" Elias shook his head. "She said, and I'm giving you the exact words here, she said, 'He means it.'" Hawthorne tilted his head slightly. "I found that interesting. Most girls that age would have said he's handsome, or he's kind, or he made me laugh. She said he means it." He looked at Elias steadily. "What do you think she meant by that?" "I can't speak for her," Elias said, "but I'd guess she meant she thought I was being honest." "Are you?" "Yes, sir." "You've got nothing," Hawthorne said. "It wasn't cruel, just precise. The way a man states a fact he needs confirmed." $14 and a horse that's seen better decades, Elias said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Hawthorne nodded slowly. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a short pipe, though he didn't light it, just held it between his fingers the way a man does when he's thinking. "Let me tell you about a man I knew," Hawthorne said. "Young fellow, about your age. Came through here in the early days when the valley was still being figured out. Good talker, charming as hell. Made a lot of promises. Every woman in 3 counties thought he walked on water. You know what he turned out to be?" "No, sir." "Nothing," Hawthorne said simply. "Just nothing." A lot of words that didn't attach to anything solid underneath. He moved on when things got hard, which they always do, and left wreckage behind him. He paused. "Lydia's mother picked that man before she picked me. You understand what I'm telling you?" Elias thought he did. "You learn to be skeptical of good appearances. I learned to be skeptical of everything I couldn't verify." Hawthorne turned the pipe over in his fingers. "Character isn't what a man says he is. It's what he does when he thinks no one who matters is watching." He looked up. "Can you prove your character to me, Carter?" "I'd like to try," Elias said. "Good." Hawthorne set the pipe on the arm of his chair, "because I'm going to give you the opportunity." Well done. He laid it out plainly. There was a ranch, the Grayson place, about 12 miles northeast of Harlow Creek, in a hollow between 2 ridges that caught the worst of the winter wind. The previous owner, a man named Walt Grayson, had died the previous spring of something that started as a bad cough and finished as pneumonia. His son, Daniel, 20 years old, no ranching experience, had been studying to be a schoolteacher in Bozeman when the news came, had inherited the operation. The Grayson Ranch was failing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow grinding way that operations failed when the person running them didn't know what they were doing and the land didn't care. Fences down, cattle losing condition. The hay stores looked thin for a Montana winter, which was like saying your boat looked thin for an ocean crossing. "Daniel Grayson is a decent young man," Hawthorne said. "He's got no quit in him, which counts for something. But he doesn't know what he doesn't know, which is a more dangerous position than ignorance you're aware of. He needs a hand with real experience." "He needs several hands," Elias said. "He can only afford one, and barely that." Hawthorne paused. "I've offered to help him find someone. The someone I had in mind was you." Elias looked at him. "What does it pay?" "Room and board," Hawthorne said. "That's all he can manage." A long silence. The wind moved through the porch rafters. "You're asking me to spend the winter working for nothing," Elias said. "I'm asking you to spend the winter working for something you can't put in a bank," Hawthorne said. "Your word means what you say it does or it doesn't. This winter will tell me which." Elias turned this over carefully. The practical reality was that he needed work, paying work, ideally. He had $14, which would last him maybe 3 weeks if he was careful, and winter coming. Taking a position that paid nothing beyond food and a roof was economically close to madness. But there was the other thing. He thought about Lydia. Not the idea of her, the specific her. The way she'd looked the first time he'd actually spoken to her, 3 months ago at the harvest gathering in town, when she'd been arguing with her cousin about something and turned to Elias as an apparent neutral party to settle the dispute. She had dark eyes that held whatever they were looking at completely, the way good land holds water. She had opinions, and she expressed them without apology. And when she laughed, not the polite kind, the real kind, it was sudden and unguarded, and it made him feel like the best version of himself. He wasn't going to get her by being sensible. "If I do this," he said slowly, "and I get through the winter, there are no guarantees attached to that? No promise that things will go differently than they would if I refused?" "None," Hawthorne said. "You might decide I'm still not suitable at the end of it." "I might? And I'd have worked a Montana winter for free." "You would." Elias looked out at the yard for a moment. Then he looked back at Arthur Hawthorne, and the old man held his gaze without flinching, which Elias respected. "What day do you want me at the Grayson place?" he asked. Something shifted in Hawthorne's eyes. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition that one thing had just been established. "Monday," he said. "I'll send word to Daniel that you're coming." Elias stood and put his hat on. They shook hands. The grip of a man who had spent years doing this and expected the same in return. He was almost to the porch steps when Hawthorne spoke again. "One more thing." Elias turned. "Lydia knows the arrangement. She'll know where you are and what you're doing this winter. Beyond that, he considered his words. You can write to her if you want. I won't prevent it, but I won't deliver the letters either. Anything between you two has to be worked out on its own terms. Understood. He rode back to Harlow Creek in the early dark, and the stars were coming out hard and bright the way they did in October up here, when the air got cold enough to make the sky go deep. He thought about the conversation all the way back. He thought about what he'd agreed to. By the time he got done settled at the livery and paid for 2 nights' board, he had $11 and change left. He wrote to Lydia that night, from a corner table at the boarding house where he'd taken a room. Miss Hawthorne, your father and I have had a conversation. I suspect you know something about it already. I'll be going to the Grayson place Monday, and I'll be there through winter, if the winter lets me. I don't know what to say about the terms except that I agreed to them with my eyes open, which felt right. I wanted you to know that. I would very much like to keep writing to you, if you're agreeable to that. E. Carter. The answer came back 4 days later, delivered by a boy from the general store who handed it over with the blankness of someone who had not read the contents and absolutely had. Mr. Carter, I am agreeable to that. L. Hawthorne. P.S. My father is a fair man. He is also a difficult one. I imagine you've already noticed both things. So had I, growing up with him. I think it's worth mentioning, since you're the one who agreed to let him judge you. He read the postscript 3 times. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. The Grayson Ranch revealed itself on a gray Monday morning, low clouds sitting on the ridges, the first real bite of winter in the air. Elias rode in through a gate that needed its top hinge replaced and stopped his horse in the yard, surveying what he'd agreed to. The house itself was serviceable, solid log construction that Walt Grayson had clearly put real work into at some point. But several years of deferred maintenance had accumulated in visible ways. A section of the roof over the small lean-to kitchen had developed a sag that would be a problem when snow piled on it, the window frames needed their caulking redone, and the chimney had a crack in the mortar that Elias clocked from 10 yards out. The barn was worse. A good barn in this country was worth 3 of the house, because the house didn't need to keep animals alive through January, and this one had boards warped open at the seams on its north-facing wall, which was naturally the direction the weather came from, and the fences. He was still looking at the fences when the front door of the house opened and Daniel Grayson came out. He was younger than Elias had pictured, fresh-faced in a way that hadn't yet been eroded by outdoor work, with the slightly lost look of someone who'd been trying very hard for months and couldn't figure out why things kept going wrong anyway. He was maybe 5'10", lean, wearing clothes that had been bought for a classroom rather than a ranch. "You're Carter," he said. Not a question, just landing on it. "I am." Elias dismounted. "You're Daniel." "Yeah." They shook hands. Daniel's grip was improving. There was actual callus starting to form, but his eyes were tired in a way that went beyond sleep. "I'll be honest with you. I don't know exactly what Mr. Hawthorne told you, but things are—" He looked around the yard as if searching for the right word. "Behind." "How many head are you running?" "Supposed to be 63. I've lost 4 since August." "Disease or the elements?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "One was disease, I think. The others—" He paused. "Honestly, I don't know. I found them down and couldn't figure out what happened." "Show me the herd," Elias said. They walked out to the main pasture, and Elias spent an hour going among the cattle slowly, looking at their condition. Some of it was poor enough to make his jaw tighten. Thin animals going into a Montana winter were animals that died in a Montana winter. It wasn't complicated, but it was the kind of thing you had to know to know. "Your hay situation," he said as they walked back. "What are you actually looking at?" 2 full stacks in the barn, another partial in the field. That enough to get 60 cattle through to April? Daniel hesitated. My father's notes said it should be. Your father knew what he was doing. Did he account for this winter being hard? Elias looked at the sky, the mountains, the angle of the light. He'd been doing this long enough to read the coming season in those things, and what he read wasn't encouraging. We're going to need more hay. Daniel's expression shifted toward the particular misery of someone receiving news they don't have the money to act on. I can't. There isn't. He stopped. I've got about $70 I can put to work before spring. That's everything. Elias ran the numbers in his head. It was possible. Not comfortable, but possible, if they were careful and if they bought right, and if nothing went catastrophically sideways, which in Montana in winter was never a guarantee. All right, he said. Here's what we need to do first. He spent the rest of that day walking every foot of fence on the property and making a list. 340 yards of fence in various states of disrepair. The priority sections, the ones that could let cattle onto the road or into the Hadley spread to the north, first, the rest in order of importance. That evening, Daniel built a fire and made coffee, and they sat at the table in the main room with Elias's list between them. The room had the feel of a place where someone had tried to make a home and hadn't quite gotten there. Walt Grayson's things still present everywhere, his coat still on its hook by the door, his hat on the shelf. Daniel hadn't touched them, which Elias understood without having to ask about it. You hungry? Daniel asked. I could eat. I've got beans. And bread from 2 days ago. It's not... He stopped himself from apologizing. It's what I've got. Beans are fine, Elias said. They ate without much conversation. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window sashes. At some point, the fire popped and threw a spark against the hearthstone, and they both watched it die. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. Go ahead. Why did you take this? Hawthorne told me what the pay is, or what it isn't. He looked at Elias with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned it was impolite to ask things directly. There's got to be better situations available. Elias was quiet for a moment. Outside, something, probably a branch, scraped against the side of the house. I made a commitment, he said finally. To Hawthorne? To myself, Elias said. Hawthorne just gave me the occasion. Daniel seemed to think about this. He was clearly the kind of person who thought carefully before speaking, which Elias appreciated. Is it about his daughter? He asked. No point in lying. Partly. And the other part? Elias looked at the fire for a moment. I want to know what I'm made of, he said. This winter's going to tell me. Daniel nodded slowly, like that made sense to him in a way he hadn't expected. He got up and refilled the coffee without being asked, and Elias took it as the closest thing to gratitude that the situation currently had room for. The work began in earnest at first light the following morning, and it didn't stop for a reason that could properly be called adequate until darkness made it impossible. Elias had always been a good worker, not the kind who made a lot of noise about it, just the kind who kept moving. He'd learned early that most hard things in life yielded to simple persistence the way wood yields to a saw. Not fast, not gracefully, but eventually. You kept going and the thing got done. He started with the north fence because the north fence was where the wind in the winter were coming from, and a fence that failed there in January meant cattle drifting and potentially dying before you found them. He pulled rotten posts and drove new ones, working a post hole digger into ground that was already starting to firm up with the cold. His hands blistered in the first 2 days, even though he thought he was past the blistering stage of his life, and he wrapped them at night with strips of cloth and went back at it in the morning. Daniel worked alongside him. This was notable. Elias had half expected the young man to direct and supervise, the way some owners did. Instead, he showed up at dawn with his coat on and his gloves in his hand and said, "What do we start with?" Every day. He wasn't skilled. He drove posts crooked and had to be corrected repeatedly, and he couldn't string wire at the tension it needed to be strung. And twice in the first week, he let the wire get away from him in ways that required the sort of language that doesn't belong in a schoolroom. But he didn't complain, and he didn't make excuses, and he got faster as the days went on. Your father teach you anything about ranching? Elias asked one afternoon, the two of them working opposite ends of a section of wire. Some, Daniel grunted, pulling tension. I think he thought he'd have more time to teach me. Neither of us planned for... He stopped. Right, Elias said. They worked in silence for a while. The wind was coming up from the northwest, cutting. He left good notes, Daniel said eventually. Journals. I've been reading them at night. He knew this land. A pause. I feel like I'm learning it from a book. You're learning it from the land, Elias said. The book just tells you what someone else figured out before you. The land tells you what applies to yours. Daniel looked at him. That's actually useful. Don't sound so surprised. The young man laughed, which was the first time Elias had heard him do it, and it changed his face completely. "Sorry," Daniel said. You don't talk a lot, and then you do, and it's usually something that makes sense." "I talk when I have something to say." "My professor at the college talked constantly," Daniel said. "I don't think he knew half of what he thought he did. A lot of people are like that." "Are you?" Elias thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "it's a thing to watch for." The letter from Lydia arrived at the end of the second week, forwarded through the Harlow Creek post office to the Grayson Ranch's occasional mail collection. Elias read it after supper, sitting close to the lamp while Daniel read his father's journals on the other side of the table. "Mr. Carter, Father told me he sent you to the Grayson place. He didn't tell me why, which means he assumed I already knew or he wanted to see whether I'd ask. I did not ask. I imagine you'd approve of that strategy. The weather here is turning cold in the evenings now. The cottonwoods along the creek have gone yellow. It's the nicest week of autumn, the week before everything turns brown and grim. I'm writing this on the porch because it seemed right to write to you from outdoors, since that's presumably where you are most of the time. Tell me something true about where you are. Not polite. True." He read that last line 3 times. Then he put the letter down and thought about it for a while, looking at the fire. He wrote back the following Sunday, which was the only day the work slowed enough to give him time. "Miss Hawthorne, something true. This ranch is harder shaped than I thought, and fixing it matters to me more than I expected. And I'm not sure how much of that is about your father's challenge, and how much is just that the work itself got its teeth into me. That's usually how it goes. You start something because of a reason, and then the thing itself becomes the reason. Something else true. I think about you more than I should, given that I'm essentially living in a barn. E. Carter. P.S. It is not, to be precise, a barn. It is a house. It smells somewhat like a barn." The distinction felt important to mention. Her response when it came was one sentence. The barn comment made me laugh for an embarrassingly long time, and then, below it, in smaller letters, as if added as an afterthought, "I think about you more than I should also." There. That's true. He folded that one even more carefully than the first. November arrived with the seriousness that Montana residents understood and newcomers did not. The temperature dropped over 3 days in a way that wasn't gradual. It was more like a door closing. One morning, the water in the basin outside was unfrozen. The next morning, frozen solid. The mountains disappeared behind a low ceiling of cloud that settled on them like a lid. And then, on a Thursday in the second week of November, the snow started. It snowed for 4 days. Not the soft, cinematic kind of snow that made landscapes pretty. The kind that came sideways, driven by a wind that had been building speed since somewhere north of anywhere, and had nothing to slow it down until it hit the ridges above the Grayson Hollow. The kind that got into the barn through the gaps Elias hadn't finished sealing, packed against the fence posts, buried the lower rails, and turned the cattle from individual animals into suggestions of shapes in white. He worked through all of it. He was up before light and out in it, breaking ice on the water troughs 3 times a day because they froze between visits. He was checking fences, checking cattle, checking the hay stores, moving through the white with his head down and his coat pulled tight, and his hands, inside the gloves, not entirely warm, even so. He learned the layout of the ranch in the dark and the snow, the way you learned it when you couldn't afford to get lost, by counting steps, by knowing where the land sloped, by developing the kind of orientation that lived in the body rather than the mind. Daniel learned it alongside him. This was the thing about Daniel Grayson that Elias kept coming back to. The young man could have stayed inside. He had reasons to. He was the owner. He wasn't a hired hand. The weather was objectively miserable, and he was not, by his own admission, cut out for this work in any natural way. But every morning he appeared, bundled up and looking cold before they'd even opened the door. And every morning he said the same thing. What do we start with? One morning, this was in the 3rd week of November, the snow still deep from the last storm and another one building on the horizon. Daniel slipped on the ice outside the barn and went down hard, his boots sliding out from under him, and he hit the frozen ground on his hip and side with a sound that made Elias wince from 10 feet away. He lay there for a moment. Elias walked over and stood above him. "You all right?" Daniel looked up from the ice, and for a moment his face had the specific expression of someone deciding whether they were going to cry or not. He was hurting. It was obvious. "I'm fine," he said. You don't look fine. Well, I'm... He stopped, blinked, seemed to make a decision. I'm going to be fine, is what I mean. Elias offered him a hand and pulled him up. Daniel stood, tested the hip gingerly, grimaced. Go inside, Elias said. I'll do the troughs this morning. I can... Daniel! Elias said it the way his father had sometimes said his name. Not harsh, just definitive. Go inside, warm up. You'll be back at it this afternoon. That's not weakness, that's sense. The young man looked like he wanted to argue. Then he looked at the ice and the barn and the gray sky promising more weather. All right, he said. Thank you. He went in. Elias did the troughs and the hay and checked the east fence where the snow load had been worrying him. And while he worked, alone in the white silence of the morning, he thought about something he didn't usually think about while working. He was happy. Not comfortable, not warm, not secure in any conventional sense, but happy. In that specific, peculiar way that hard work in service of something real produced, when you were the kind of person it produced it in. He had never been good at explaining this to people who didn't already understand it. He'd try to explain it to Lydia someday, maybe. The thought arrived without announcement, and he let it sit there, looking at it, someday. He drove another stake into a fence post and kept moving. They wrote to each other every 2 weeks, sometimes more. Lydia's letters were nothing like what he might have expected from a rancher's daughter raised in comfort. They were direct, observant, occasionally funny in ways that surprised him. She wrote about her father, about the ranch, about a book she was reading that she said made her impatient, about an argument she'd had with her cousin over something that had started about quilting and expanded into a philosophical dispute about whether people were fundamentally good or fundamentally selfish. I took the position that people are mostly good but situationally terrible, she wrote. My cousin thought I was naive. I told her I thought she was bitter. We haven't resolved it. I think we're both somewhat right. He wrote to her about the work, mostly, about the cattle, about Daniel's progress, which was real and steady, about the landscape in winter, which was brutal but had a particular kind of beauty that required you to stop resisting it before you could see it. There was a morning last week, he wrote once, after a storm, when the snow had stopped and the sky had cleared and the whole valley was just white and still. And the light came in low from the east and made every fence post and tree branch throw a shadow 10 times its own length across the snow. It looked like the land was writing something in its own language. I stood there longer than I should have, just looking at it. There was work to do. I stood there anyway. She wrote back, I think that might be the most beautiful thing you've said. Don't tell anyone I said that. It would completely undermine my reputation for practical thinking. In December, she told him that a man from Bozeman had come to call on her. Her father had allowed it. He was a merchant's son, 27 years old with good prospects and a new coat. Elias read that part of the letter twice. Something in his chest did a thing he didn't fully want to examine. She continued, He talked about himself for approximately 4 hours. I have nothing else to report about him. He let out a breath. E. Carter, he wrote back, you have good judgment. I try, she replied. It was your letter from last week that reminded me to use it. He never asked which part. January was the test, not the physical test, though that was real enough, with temperatures dropping to places that made a man feel the limits of what his body was actually built for. But the other test, the one that had no visible measurement. Around the middle of the month, the letter came from a spread near Billings, a real outfit, 400 cattle, competitive wages, a position that would pay him through the winter and into spring. Word had gotten around the way it did that Elias Carter was a capable hand. They wanted him. He sat with the letter for 2 days. Daniel didn't know about it. Elias had gotten the mail himself on a supply run to Harlow Creek. He held it, thought about it, put it in his coat pocket and carried it around, which was the thing he did when he hadn't decided something yet. The Billings spread was offering $40 a month. Real money. Money that would change his situation by spring. He thought about what he'd told Arthur Hawthorne, the exact words, as best he could remember them. I made a commitment. He wrote back to Billings and declined the position. He didn't tell anyone he'd done it. Then, 3 days later, 2 cattle died in the night. They found them in the morning, frozen, in the low corner of the east pasture where the cold air pooled. Elias blamed himself for it. He knew that corner was a problem, had meant to address the fencing there to allow cattle to move out of it, and had gotten to other things first. The calculus of limited time in a difficult winter meant decisions that were sometimes wrong. Daniel stood looking at the two animals for a long time without speaking. "Not your fault," Elias said. "I should have sorted that corner 2 weeks ago." "But you told me—" Daniel stopped. "You mentioned that area. I said I'd get to it. I didn't. We both had it on the list and both ran out of day before we got to it." Elias looked at him. "Are you going to spend time on that, or are you going to make sure it doesn't happen again?" Daniel looked at the cattle, swallowed. "The second one." "All right then." They got the fence sorted that afternoon. The remaining cattle were moved out of that corner and the low-lying area nearest the ridgeline. It cost them a long, brutal day in cold that made Elias's lungs ache, and they were both half frozen when they got back inside. And Daniel burned the beans he was trying to heat, and they ate them anyway because neither of them had the energy to make anything else. Sitting at the table afterward, hands wrapped around coffee mugs, Daniel said something unexpected. "You could have left, any time." He looked at his coffee. "I wouldn't have blamed you. There's nothing here that pays. The work is hard. He paused. "I'm learning, but slowly. You could be anywhere." Elias looked at him for a moment. "You're learning faster than you think," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." "I know." "Then why are you still here?" Elias turned his mug in his hands. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had dropped, which meant it would be colder still by morning. "Because I said I would be," he said. Daniel nodded once, like that settled something in his mind that had been unsettled. He went back to his coffee. Later, Elias wrote to Lydia, not about Daniel, not directly, but about the thing underneath it. "I've been thinking about the difference between a promise you make when you're feeling good and a promise you keep when you're not. The second kind seems like it might be the only kind that counts. The first kind is just enthusiasm." She wrote back within a week, which was fast given the mail situation. "I think you're right. I also think most people never test that difference on purpose. They hope it won't come up. You went out looking for it. That says something. I'm still working out exactly what." He read that letter until he almost had it memorized. The winter deepened. He kept going. But the snow still lay thick on the Grayson Ranch when February turned, covering the world in a silence so complete that some mornings Elias stood in the yard and heard nothing. Nothing at all, except the small sounds of his own breathing and the creak of the cold wood in the barn, and he felt like the last man on earth, which was both lonely and, strangely, fine. He'd gotten used to hard things. That had always been true of him. What surprised him was that he'd also gotten used to this particular patch of ground, this particular set of problems. This particular young man who showed up every morning saying, "What do we start with?" and had gone from driving posts crooked to doing it right without being told. Something had happened here that he hadn't entirely planned on. He'd come to care about it, not for Hawthorne's sake, not even entirely for Lydia's sake, but because the work was real, and the land was real, and Daniel Grayson was trying in earnest, and there was a kind of dignity in that combination that Elias hadn't had a word for before, and maybe still didn't, not exactly. He thought about this on a gray afternoon in late February, mending the last section of fence on the west boundary, his breath coming out in clouds, and his fingers stiff inside the gloves. He was thinking about it when he heard hoofbeats on the frozen ground and looked up to see a rider coming in from the road. He recognized the horse before he recognized the rider. It was one of Hawthorne's horses, a big black with a white sock on the left front foot that Elias had noticed in the corral that first afternoon on the Hawthorne porch. The rider pulled up 10 yards away, and it wasn't Arthur Hawthorne. It was Lydia. She was wearing a heavy coat and a wool hat pulled down over her ears, and her cheeks were red from the ride, and she sat the horse with the ease of someone who'd been doing it her whole life. She looked at him across the frozen field with an expression he couldn't fully read from the distance. He set down his tools and walked toward her. She didn't dismount. "You're not supposed to be here," he said when he got close enough. Which was not, he reflected, the most elegant thing he'd ever said. "No," she agreed. "Your father know?" "No?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm not here to make promises or ask for them. She stopped. "I wanted to see that you were real, that this was real. I've been reading your letters for 4 months, and sometimes—" She looked away briefly, then back. "Sometimes paper isn't enough." He stood there in the February cold, with the fence half mended behind him, and his hands rough from the work, and his coat needing mending itself, and $14, still $14, to his name. "I'm real," he said. "I can see that," she said. They looked at each other for a moment that had no particular shape to it, not romantic in the way stories described, not dramatic, just two people seeing each other clearly from where they actually stood. "You should get back before dark," he said. "I know." She didn't move immediately. "Are you all right?" "Honestly." He thought about the cold, and the work, and the cattle they'd lost, and the cattle they'd saved, and the letters, and the billings offer he'd turned down, and Daniel Grayson saying, "What do we start with every morning?" "Yeah," he said, "I am." She nodded, like that was the answer she'd come to verify. She turned the horse. "Elias," she said. He looked up. "Spring's coming," she said. 2, 3 more weeks. Then she rode back the way she'd come, and he stood watching her go until she disappeared over the rise, and then he stood there a moment longer in the cold and the silence. Then he picked up his tools and finished the fence. 3 weeks after Lydia rode away over that frozen rise, the snow started to melt. Not all at once. Montana didn't do anything all at once, except freeze. It came in stages, the way things that had been locked up a long time came back. A south-facing slope showing bare dirt for the first time in months. A creek somewhere on the property making noise again under its ice. The cattle lifting their heads in the morning in a different way, like they could smell something changing underneath the cold. Elias noticed all of it. He noticed most things, which was both useful and occasionally exhausting. What he also noticed was Daniel Grayson. The young man who had arrived at the Grayson Ranch in the fall, not knowing which end of a post-hole digger to hold, was not the same young man moving through the March mud now. He was harder in the shoulders, quieter in the way he thought before he spoke, and he developed the habit, without being taught it, of walking the fence line every morning before breakfast. Not because Elias told him to, because he'd learned somewhere in the grinding middle of the winter that the fence line was where problems announced themselves earliest. That was the thing about real work. You couldn't fake your way to that understanding. You had to earn it cold and tired and sometimes wrong, and Daniel had done exactly that. One morning, early March, he came back from the fence walk and stuck his head into the barn where Elias was working on a broken halter. "East section's holding," Daniel said. "North looks clean. I found a post heaving from the frost on the lower west. I'll get to it this afternoon." Elias didn't look up from the halter. "All right." A pause. "You're not going to check?" "Should I?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, and there was something solid in how he said it. Not arrogant, just sure. "Then I won't," Elias said. That was the whole conversation, and it carried more in it than most longer ones. The letter he'd been waiting on from Arthur Hawthorne arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of March. Not through the post. It came with Olson, the big quiet Swede, who rode in on a cold morning and handed the envelope to Elias without comment, the way he'd been delivering things wordlessly since October. Elias opened it standing in the yard, Olson still on his horse, apparently in no particular hurry. "Carter, I've had reports from 3 neighbors about the Grayson operation this winter. I did not ask for them. They came because people talk, and what they're saying is worth knowing. Come to the ranch Saturday. Bring Daniel Grayson if he can be spared from the work. A. Hawthorne." He read it twice. The letter told him nothing about which direction Saturday was going to go, which he suspected was intentional. He showed it to Daniel that evening. Daniel read it once, set it on the table, and was quiet in a way that meant he was processing something that had weight to it. "What do you think it means?" he finally said. "I think it means what it says," Elias told him. "He wants to see you." "He's checking on me." "He's been checking on both of us all winter," Elias said. "Just not in person." Daniel looked at him. "You knew that?" "I figured it." He reached for his coffee. "That's his way. He doesn't watch you do the thing. He watches what people say about you after." The young man was quiet again, running his thumb along the edge of the table the way he did when he was thinking hard. Outside, the last of the evening light was going gray and thin. "I didn't do any of this for him," Daniel said. "I did it because it needed doing." "I know," Elias said. So it shouldn't matter what he thinks. It shouldn't, Elias agreed. Whether it does or doesn't is a separate question. Daniel looked up at him. Does it matter to you what he thinks? Elias considered it honestly, which was the only way he considered things. Yes, he said, but not for the reason you might expect. What reason then? Because he's a man who's been watching people carefully for 40 years, and his judgment usually lands somewhere close to true. That's worth something independent of whether I like the verdict. Daniel looked at the letter again. That's a generous way to think about someone who's judging you. It's a practical way, Elias said. Generous is different. They rode to the Hawthorne Ranch on Saturday in weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Not quite cold enough for snow, not warm enough to feel like spring, a thin cloud cover making the light flat and directionless. The land they rode through showed the damage of the winter honestly. Bent fence posts, a tree down across a ditch line somewhere to the east, muddy tracks where cattle had churned the thaw into something close to paste. The Hawthorne operation, when it came into view, looked the way it always looked, solid, maintained, the product of decades of consistent attention. Elias had been thinking about that more lately, about the difference between something built fast and something built to last. Arthur Hawthorne met them on the porch. He looked at Daniel Grayson for a long moment, not unkindly, just completely, the way he looked at things he was evaluating. "Daniel," he said, "Mr. Hawthorne." Daniel didn't fidget, which was the right call. "Come in," Hawthorne said. "Both of you." Inside, there was coffee already made, which Elias took as a good sign without putting too much weight on it. They sat around the main table, heavy oak, scarred from years of use, and Hawthorne set his cup down and looked at them in the way of a man who has decided what he's going to say and is taking a moment before he says it. "I've been hearing things," he said, "about the Grayson Ranch this winter, about how it was run." Daniel said nothing. Elias said nothing. Jim Hadley rode over to check on things in January, after that bad stretch of storms. He was expecting to find cattle down and fences shot. What he found instead? Hawthorne paused, like the words needed room. He told me he found the place tighter than Walt Grayson ran it in his best years. He specifically said that. He looked at Daniel. "That was your father." Daniel's jaw moved once. "I know." "High standard," Hawthorne said. "I know that too." Hawthorne looked at him for another moment, then looked at Elias. "He tells me the credit belongs mainly to you." Elias shook his head. "Hadley's wrong on that." "Is he?" Daniel Grayson worked every day of that winter, in weather that would have sent most men inside. He learned fast and he didn't quit. The credit belongs to him. He said it flatly, without decoration, because that was the truth of it, and there wasn't a better way to say true things than plainly. Hawthorne looked at him for a long beat. Something passed through the old man's expression. Not surprise exactly, but something in that neighborhood. "Hadley said you'd say that," Hawthorne said quietly. "Then Hadley knows me better than I thought," Elias said. Hawthorne's mouth moved, the closest thing he seemed to have to a smile in these kinds of conversations. He looked back at Daniel. "Your father would be pleased," he said. It came out simple and direct, and Elias saw it land on Daniel the way those kinds of words always landed, hard and deep, and in a place that had been waiting for them. Daniel looked down at the table, swallowed. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was even. They talked for an hour after that, about the ranch, about the hay situation, about what Daniel needed to do to get through the calving season, which was coming fast now. Hawthorne gave practical advice, the kind that came from experience rather than theory, and Daniel listened in the way that people listened when they'd worked hard enough to know the difference between useful information and noise. When they stood to leave, Hawthorne walked them to the door. He shook Daniel's hand with both of his, which was a thing Elias had never seen him do. Then he looked at Elias. "Stay a moment," he said. Daniel went on to the horses. Elias stayed. They stood on the porch, the two of them, in the flat gray light of the March afternoon. Hawthorne didn't speak immediately. He looked out at his land, his hands in his coat pockets. "You turned down a position in Billings," he said. Elias looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Word travels?" The old man glanced at him sidelong. 40 a month. "Yes. And you stayed." "I said I would." Hawthorne nodded slowly. He pulled one hand out of his pocket and looked at it, then put it back. I'm going to tell you something I don't say out loud very often, Carter. Elias waited. I was wrong to test you the way I did. He said it without looking at him. I could see who you were the day you rode out here. I knew it when you sat in that chair and admitted straight out you had $14 and a tired horse. A man who lies about his situation doesn't do that. He paused. But I tested you anyway, because I'm a man who has been burned by his own judgment before, and I don't trust easy anymore, even when I should. Elias didn't say anything because he could feel there was more. Lydia's mother, Hawthorne said. He stopped, started again. She loved a man before me. Young man, like you. Good-looking. Confident. Said all the right things. He was quiet for a moment. He left when the first real difficulty arrived. Not a dramatic leaving, just one morning he was there and then he wasn't. His voice had gone flat in the particular way of people describing things they'd stopped being angry about and started just carrying. She was 22. It left a mark that took years to work out. He turned and looked directly at Elias. I promised myself when Lydia was old enough that I would not let her make a choice about a man based on what he said, only on what he did when no one was making it worth his while to do it. He held Elias's gaze steady. You understand now why the winter was the shape it was. I understand, Elias said. You're not angry. No. Why not? Elias thought about it. Because I'd have done the same thing, he said. If she were my daughter. The old man looked at him for a moment more. Then he turned back to the yard. Come to supper next Sunday, he said. Bring Daniel if he can manage it. It wasn't the offer Elias had ridden the winter toward, but it was a door, and he walked back to his horse knowing the shape of what it opened onto. The calving season arrived before the mud had properly dried, which was Montana's idea of a joke. April came in raw and uncertain, the weather doing things that made no meteorological sense. Warm one day, ice the next, snow on a Thursday that melted by Friday. And through all of it, the cattle began having calves with the unconcerned indifference of animals that had been doing this forever and would keep doing it regardless of what humans thought about the timing. Elias had worked calving seasons before, on 3 different spreads. He knew the rhythm of it, the watching, the waiting, the sudden need for speed when something went wrong, the particular weight of a new calf in your arms when you pulled it in cold weather and had to get it breathing and on its feet before the cold got to it. He knew the difference between a cow that needed help and one that didn't, and he knew which gap in that knowledge could cost you an animal. Daniel did not know any of this. He learned it in about 10 days, in the way that people learn things when the education was immediate and the consequences were real. The first hard night came on a Thursday, a cold snap that dropped back below freezing after a week of warmth, and 3 cows decided to calve simultaneously in the lower pasture at 2 in the morning as if they'd planned it. Elias heard the first one from the bunk room, something in the quality of the sound outside, a shift in the cattle's noise, and he was up and dressed in 2 minutes. He woke Daniel by knocking once on his bedroom door hard. Calving, he said, now, dress warm. He heard Daniel hit the floor. They worked through the night, the 2 of them moving between cows in the dark and cold, lantern light throwing orange shadows across the frost-white ground. 2 of the 3 calves came without trouble. The third, a big one, wrong angle, the cow in distress, took an hour, and Elias on his knees in the mud, guiding the calf out, while Daniel held the lantern and did exactly what he was told without asking questions, which was what the situation required. When the calf finally came free, and Elias got it breathing and laid it up against its mother, he sat back on his heels in the mud for a moment and just breathed. That's it, Daniel said. He was pale under the lantern light, and there was mud on his coat, and his hands were shaking slightly. Cold, or adrenaline, or both. That's it, Elias said. Daniel looked at the calf, which was making the uncoordinated efforts at standing that new calves made, all legs and determination and no coordination whatsoever. Something moved across the young man's face. That's something, he said, which was not an eloquent statement, but Elias understood exactly what he meant. Yeah, he said. It is. They got back inside as the sky was going gray in the east, and Daniel put coffee on while Elias washed the mud off his hands and arms with water that was cold enough to make him curse under his breath. How many more nights like that? Daniel asked. Depends on the cows. 2 weeks, maybe. Could be more. Daniel poured the coffee, handed Elias a cup, and sat down. He looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who'd used up reserves they didn't know they had. I keep thinking, he said, about whether I would have made it through the winter without you. You would have, Elias said. I don't think so. You would have, Elias repeated. Maybe not without losses. Probably not as clean, but you would have made it because you're the kind of person who doesn't stop. He paused. That's not a nothing thing, Daniel. A lot of people stop. The young man wrapped both hands around his coffee and looked out the window at the gray dawn. My father was like that, he said. Didn't stop. I gathered. I used to think it was easy for him, that he was just built that way, and it didn't cost him anything. What do you think now? I think it cost him everything, and he did it anyway. He paused. I think that's what it actually means. Elias drank his coffee and didn't add anything, because Daniel had arrived at that on his own, and it didn't need commentary. The Sunday suppers at the Hawthorne Ranch became a regular thing, starting in April. Elias rode over in the evenings when the day's work allowed it, arriving before dark and staying through the meal and the conversation that came after. It was a household that ate seriously and talked afterward, Hawthorne holding court on whatever was happening with the county water rights issue or the cattle prices. His wife Margaret managing the table with the efficient grace of someone who had run a large household for 30 years and made it look like no effort at all. And Lydia. Lydia at the table was different from Lydia in a letter. She was more specific in her opinions, her reactions, the particular way she disagreed with her father on certain points without backing down and without making it a fight either. She had a quality that Elias had noticed but not found a word for until he watched her one evening talking about something a neighboring family was going through, a difficulty, and she was being practical and clear about it, but underneath the practicality was a genuine concern that she wasn't performing for anyone's benefit. She actually cared about specific people in specific situations, not in the abstract. He thought about that on the ride back to the Grayson Ranch on those Sunday evenings, the dark coming down and the stars getting bright, and Dunn moving along the familiar road with the ease of an old horse that knew the way home. One Sunday in late April, after supper, Hawthorne went to see to something in the barn, and Margaret found a reason to be elsewhere. Neither of them made a production of it, they just weren't there anymore. And Elias and Lydia were left at the table with the remnants of supper and the low lamp. You're different than you were in October, she said. He considered this. The winter changes things. No, she said. Not the winter, you. She looked at him steadily. You're more sure of yourself, not arrogant, just settled, like you know something you didn't before. He thought about what he knew, about Daniel showing up every morning, about the Billings offer he'd refused, about the calves and the fences and the long, cold nights that turned out somehow to have been worth exactly what they cost. I think I know what I'm made of now, he said, more than I did. And what are you made of? He looked at her across the table. Outside somewhere, an owl was calling in the dark. Enough, he said. I think enough. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down and moved her coffee cup slightly on the table, a small, unnecessary adjustment. I read every one of your letters twice, she said. The first time for what you said, the second time for what you didn't say but meant. What did I mean, he asked. That I didn't say. She looked up again. That you weren't going to quit. Not for money, not for comfort, not for anything. She paused. I needed to know that before... She stopped herself. Started over. I've watched my mother love my father for 30 years. She always said she knew who he was before she said yes. Not what he had. Who he was. She held his gaze. I was looking for the same thing. The lamp between them put soft light on her face and left the edges of the room in dark. And Elias sat across from her with the particular stillness of someone who understood they were inside an important moment and didn't want to move wrong inside it. Did you find it? He asked. She was quiet for just a moment. Working on it, she said. And that was enough. More than enough for where they stood, in the spring of the year, with the winter behind them and everything else still ahead. Margaret came back to clear the table, and the moment folded back into the ordinary evening, and Elias rode home in the dark with the stars very bright above the valley, and the night smelling of thawed earth and new grass starting, and the particular freshness that Montana produced in late April when the winter had finally released its grip on things. He got back to the Grayson Ranch after 10. The house was dark, Daniel asleep already, which was reasonable given they were up before 5 most mornings. He put Dunn up quietly, made sure the old horse had water and hay, and stood for a moment in the open barn door looking out at the night. The valley was quiet, in that way it got when everything was still. A quiet that wasn't empty but full, the kind of quiet that had things living in it. The cattle were dark shapes in the near pasture. The fence posts stood at their regular intervals along the ridgeline, visible in the starlight. The barn behind him smelled of hay and horses, and the particular animal warmth that was one of the more honest smells in the world. He'd come here in October with $14, and the specific kind of desperation that comes from wanting something badly enough to do something foolish for it. He was leaving with, what? Not much more money, not a promise from anyone. Lydia's working on it, and Hawthorne's come to supper and the knowledge of what he was made of, which was not a thing you could put in a bank, but turned out to be the thing everything else was built on. He went inside and went to bed. In the morning, Daniel was already up when Elias came out of the bunk room, already had the coffee going, already had his coat and gloves on the hook by the door. Fence line first, Daniel said. Then I want to look at the east pasture, but I think the drainage is backing up from the snowmelt. Check the lower section too, Elias said. The soil's softer on that slope. It'll go first. Daniel nodded, poured coffee into 2 cups without asking, set one on the table in front of Elias's chair. You're heading out soon, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Elias looked at him. I know you are, Daniel said. It's almost May. You came for the winter. He picked up his cup. I'm not saying it like it's a problem. I'm just saying I know. Another 2 weeks, Elias said, through the rest of calving. All right, Daniel drank his coffee. Then I'm on my own. Then you're on your own, Elias agreed. You'll be fine. Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Will you... He stopped, started again. If something goes sideways, later in the season, is it all right if I write to you? It was phrased as a question, but it had something in it that wasn't easy to ask, and Elias understood exactly what it cost the young man to ask it. The admission that he might not know everything yet, the willingness to say so out loud. Write to me any time, he said. Daniel nodded once, and that was settled, and they drank their coffee and went out to work. And the morning was cold and clear with that particular April brightness that felt like a reward after a long, dark earning. The Grayson Ranch was alive under their hands. That was the only way Elias knew to think about it. The place they'd ridden into in October, broken fences, thin cattle, a barn with gaps in its boards, wasn't this place. This was a working ranch in the early spring, its cattle healthy, its fences standing, its young owner knowing how to walk the fence line before breakfast. He'd come to save a ranch and had done that, but the ranch had done something for him too, in return, the way hard things sometimes did when you didn't run from them. He thought about that riding out for the morning work, the spring sun warm on his back, Dunn moving under him with the easy stride of an old horse that had earned his easy mornings. 2 more weeks, then whatever came next. He rode out of the Grayson Ranch on a Friday morning in the 2nd week of May, and the leaving was quieter than he'd expected. Daniel walked out to the yard when he heard Elias saddling up, and stood there with his hands in his pockets while Elias checked the cinch and tied his saddlebag down. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of May morning that made you forget Montana had spent 6 months trying to kill everything on it. You've got the drainage sorted on the east pasture, Elias said, not looking up from the saddlebag. Don't let it back up again come June. That whole low section will bog. I know. And the Hadley fence on the north boundary. Check it after any hard rain. That soil shifts. Elias. He looked up. Daniel was looking at him with the direct, uncomplicated expression of a young man who had figured out how to say what he meant sometime around January when the cold had stripped away everything unnecessary. I've got it, Daniel said. I know what to do. Elias looked at him. Really looked. The way you looked at something you were about to leave behind and wanted to remember clearly. The man standing in the yard was not the boy who'd been driving fence posts crooked in November. Same face, same frame, but the whole way he stood in the world was different, settled into it. Like he belonged to the land now instead of just owning it. Yeah, Elias said, you do. He mounted up. Dunn shifted under him, ready to move after the long winter of short distances. Right if anything goes sideways, Elias said. You said that already. Saying it again. Daniel almost smiled. Safe ride. Elias touched the brim of his hat and turned Dunn toward the road. He didn't look back, which was a habit he'd developed early. Not from coldness, but because looking back at things you'd left had a way of making the leaving harder without making it any different. The road south toward Harlow Creek was soft from the spring thaw, and Dunn picked his way along the drier edges with the careful attention of an old horse that had learned to conserve itself. Around them, the valley was doing what it did in May, coming back so fast you could almost watch it, the grass going green almost while you looked at it, the willows along the creek runs gone from bare sticks to pale yellow-green practically overnight. After 6 months of white and gray, the color was almost too much. He had $14 and some coins in his pocket, same as when he'd started. He turned this over in his mind without particular distress. The $14 was a fact, not a verdict. He'd known when he rode to the Grayson place what the winter would pay him in money, and he'd gone anyway, and what he'd collected instead was not the kind of thing that fit in a pocket, but it was real. What he didn't know, what was still genuinely open, was what Arthur Hawthorne intended to say to him when he arrived at the ranch that morning. Hawthorne had sent word through Olson the previous week. Come by when you're done at Grayson's, nothing else. No indication of tone or intent. Elias had been thinking about it more than he'd admitted to himself. He was not a man who talked himself into false certainty to feel better, which was both a quality he valued in himself and occasionally a burden. He genuinely did not know what Hawthorne was going to say. He thought he'd earned something. Not Lydia, you didn't earn a person, but something, a fair hearing, an honest verdict. He thought he'd done what he said he'd do, which was the only standard that had ever made sense to him. Whether that was enough for Arthur Hawthorne was Arthur Hawthorne's question to answer. The Hawthorne Ranch came into view just before 9 in the morning. The place looked the same as it always did. Capable, maintained, the kind of operation that didn't need to announce itself because the evidence was everywhere you looked. Hawthorne himself was not on the porch this time. He was in the yard, talking to one of his hands about something, and he turned when he heard Dunn on the road and watched Elias ride in without any visible change in expression. Carter. He said it the same way he'd said it that first afternoon in October. Just the name, just the fact. Mr. Hawthorne. Elias dismounted and tied Dunn to the rail. The ranch hand drifted away. Hawthorne looked at Elias for a moment. That complete, unhurried look he had, the look that had probably unnerved a lot of people over the years. How's Grayson's place? He said. It'll make it, Elias said. Daniel knows what he's doing now. Not everything, but enough. Enough to get through a summer? Enough to get through several. Hawthorne nodded, slow. Jim Hadley stopped by last week, told me he rode past the Grayson operation. He paused. Said it looked better than he'd seen it in 3 years. Daniel worked for it. Hadley said he told you that. Said you corrected him. Hawthorne's eyes were steady. Told him the credit was Daniel's. That's accurate. Hadley also said Hawthorne stopped, looked away briefly at something on the horizon, then back. He said you turned down $40 a month from a Billings outfit in January. Elias said nothing. Did you tell Daniel you did that? No. Did you tell Lydia? No. Did you tell anyone? No. Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. A horse in the far corral moved, and the sound of its hooves on the packed dirt was very clear in the silence. Why not? Hawthorne said. Elias thought about how to say it accurately. Because it wasn't something I did for anyone to know about. I turned it down because I said I'd be at the Grayson place through winter, and I meant it. That's the whole of it. Saying it out loud after the fact would have turned it into something else. The old man looked at him with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Not closed, just complex, like several things were happening in it at once. Come inside, he said. The main room of the Hawthorne house was the same as the Sunday evenings. Solid furniture, a fire that had been burning long enough to have settled into steady heat, the particular smell of a house that had been lived in hard and well for 30 years. Margaret Hawthorne appeared from the kitchen, looked at Elias with the calm assessment she'd been applying to him since April, and said she'd bring coffee. She said it like it wasn't a question, because it wasn't. They sat at the oak table. Hawthorne put his hands flat on the surface and looked at them, then looked up. "I'm going to tell you what I observed this winter," he said, "and I want you to just listen until I'm done." Elias nodded. "I had 4 separate accounts from neighbors and people passing through who had dealings with the Grayson operation between November and April. Every one of them said the same things, in different words. That the place was being run right. That the man running it, and they all meant you, not Daniel, at least at the start, was straight, didn't complain, didn't cut corners when no one was watching, didn't blame the weather or the situation when things went wrong." He paused. "One of them, Frank Collis, he runs the supply store in Ridgemont, told me you came in for supplies in December, paid cash, and when he shorted you $3 on change by accident, you caught it before you left the store and gave it back." "That's his money," Elias said. "I wasn't going to keep it. A lot of men would have." "I'm not a lot of men." Hawthorne held his gaze. "No," he said. "You're not." He picked up his coffee cup, turned it once, set it back down. "Here's what I also know. You rode into my yard in October with nothing but your word, and you've spent 7 months demonstrating that your word is the kind that actually means something. You did it without asking for recognition. You did it when there was real money on the table pointing the other direction." He paused. "And when Hadley told you that you'd save the Grayson Ranch, you told him he was wrong." "He was wrong." "Elias." It was the first time Hawthorne had used his given name. The shift in it was small but distinct, and they both felt it. "I know what you did for that boy. I know what the winter was. You can stop deflecting." Something in Elias's chest went still, and then settled. He didn't say anything. "You asked me in October if there were any guarantees," Hawthorne said. "I told you no." "You did." "I'm changing that answer." He said it plainly, the way he said everything important, without ceremony, because the thing itself was the ceremony. "I want to offer you something. Not as a reward, as a beginning." Margaret came back with the coffee, and the timing of it felt both perfectly ordinary and entirely strange, the way real moments often did when they arrived after long waiting. Hawthorne laid it out like a business arrangement because that was how he thought, and it was also how Elias thought. And between two people who thought that way, it was the most honest language available. The eastern grazing section, 400 acres of good grassland bordering Harlow Creek, land that Hawthorne owned outright but had been leasing to a neighbor for 3 seasons, was coming open at the end of May. The neighbor was relocating his operation north. Hawthorne was offering Elias the lease at fair market terms. Not charity, actual rent, actual obligations, actual accountability for the land's condition, but fair terms with a man he trusted, which was a different thing than fair terms with a stranger, because trust changed what fair looked like. "You'd need cattle," Hawthorne said. "You'd need equipment." "I'd need capital," Elias said. "Yes. I have $14. "I know what you have." Hawthorne's mouth moved. "I also know what you're worth, which is not the same number." Elias looked at him. "You're offering credit." "I'm offering partnership," Hawthorne said. "Structured credit against future earnings. Nothing given that doesn't come back. I'm not in the business of charity, and you wouldn't accept it if I were." He was right on both counts. "I'd need to see the land," Elias said, "the actual condition of it. I expected that. I'll ride with you this afternoon. I'll want to think about the terms before I agree to anything." "I'd be concerned if you didn't." They sat with that for a moment. Through the window, Elias could see the yard in the May morning, a ranch hand moving across it with purpose, the mountains behind the whole scene still carrying some snow on their upper faces. "There's something I want to say," Elias said. Hawthorne waited. "What you told me on the porch, in March, about Lydia's mother and the man before you." He chose his words carefully. "I'm not that man. I know saying so doesn't prove it, but I want to say it plainly so we both know where I stand. I'm not going to disappear when things get hard." He paused. "Things are always going to get hard. That's what things do." The old man looked at him for a long moment, the kind of long that had weight. "I know," he said quietly. "I've known for a while." Footsteps on the stairs. They both turned. Lydia came down into the main room, and either she'd been upstairs the whole time or she'd come in through the back. But she was there now, in the middle of the morning in her own home, and she looked at Elias with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting to see how something turned out. "I heard voices," she said, which was almost certainly not the whole truth. Come sit down, her father said, and he said it without any particular emphasis, but the invitation in it was clear. She sat across from Elias, the table between them, her father at the head. Morning light came through the east windows at a low angle, the way it did in May, long and warm. Her dark eyes moved from her father to Elias and back, reading the room the way she read everything. Completely. Well, she said, looking at her father. We've been talking about the east section, Hawthorne said. I know about the east section. I offered it to Carter. She looked at Elias. And? I want to see it before I agree to anything, he said. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but what lived near one. That's sensible. I thought so. Father thinks you're sensible, she said. He hasn't said so in those words, but that's what he means when he talks about you. Lydia, Hawthorne said. I'm just translating. She folded her hands on the table. He's not a man who says things directly when he doesn't have to. I've had 24 years to learn the language. I say things directly when it matters, Hawthorne said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like he was defending himself, which Elias suspected was a rare position for the man. You do, she agreed. When it matters. She looked at Elias again. Did he tell you about my mother? The question surprised him. He looked at Hawthorne quickly, who did not look uncomfortable but held very still. In March, Elias said. On the porch. She nodded slowly. He doesn't tell that story to many people. She said it simply, without making it into more than it was. I think it's the thing that made him the way he is about, she searched for the word, evidence. I understand it, Elias said. I know you do. That's why I'm not upset about the winter. She looked at her father. I was upset about the winter. For about 2 weeks in December, I was quite angry about it. She returned her gaze to Elias, matter of fact. I want you to know that. I'm not someone who accepts everything without objection just because my father decides it. I didn't think you were, Elias said. Good. She paused. I also want you to know that by January, I wasn't angry anymore. Because I read your letters and She stopped, recalibrated. I understood what was happening, what you were actually doing. She was quiet for a second. The letter about the fence post shadows on the snow. I've read that one probably a dozen times. He hadn't known that. He looked at her and she held his gaze without any particular self-consciousness about having admitted it. All right, Hawthorne said, and his voice had something gruff in it that was probably the sound of a man who loved his daughter and was sitting at a table watching something unfold that he'd created the conditions for but couldn't entirely control. We'll ride out to the east section this afternoon, the three of us. They rode out after midday when the sun was high and genuinely warm for the first time that felt like it meant something. The east section of the Hawthorne land ran from a stand of cottonwoods along Harlow Creek north and east across a long, gradual slope before leveling into a wide grass flat that ran to the base of a broken ridgeline. Elias rode it in sections the way he assessed any land, not looking for what was good, because good land sold itself, but looking for what was true. Where the water went in heavy rain, where the soil changed and what that meant for grass, where cattle would naturally want to shelter, and whether the land supported that or worked against it. He rode quietly, done beneath him picking his way with old horse care, while Hawthorne stayed back and let him work. Lydia rode alongside her father, and once, when Elias glanced back from a rise in the land, he saw them talking quietly to each other. Her father's head slightly bent toward her, her face serious in the way it got when she was saying something she meant. He looked away and kept reading the land. The grass flat at the north end was better than he'd expected. Rich, deep-rooted grass, the kind that recovered fast from heavy grazing if you managed it right. The creek access on the eastern edge was good, water year-round, the bank solid enough that cattle wouldn't wreck it in a wet spring. The ridge at the back would give wind shelter in winter, which was worth more than it looked worth in May. He rode back to where Hawthorne and Lydia waited on the edge of the cottonwoods. The south drainage is going to need work, he said. When it rains heavy, that whole lower section is going to sit wet. I know, Hawthorne said. It's been a problem. It's fixable, not cheap to fix. No. And the east fence is 20 years old, at least. Also accurate. Elias looked out at the grass, flat, the creek line, the ridge against the blue sky. He was doing arithmetic in his head. Not just money, but time and work and what was possible with what he had, which was not much, against what the land could produce, which was substantial if treated right. "I want to propose a modification to your terms," he said. Hawthorne's eyebrows moved slightly. "All right. The drainage work and the east fence. I do that myself, first season, as part of the lease instead of cash rent while it's being done. You get the improvements, I get the time to build capital before the cash payments start." He paused. "The lease rate after that is market rate. I'm not asking for a discount." Hawthorne was quiet. He looked at the land, then at Elias. "You've thought about this," he said. "On the ride over." "That's a reasonable proposal," Hawthorne said. "I'd want a clear timeline for the improvements and a written agreement on what market rate means before I shake on it." "So would I." The old man looked at him for a moment. Then he held out his hand. Elias shook it. Lydia, beside her father, said nothing. But she was watching Elias, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been trying to read since October. The one that was more than one thing at once, that had layers he could see but not fully account for. Then she looked away at the creek, at the cottonwoods going bright green in the May light, and whatever she was thinking, she kept to herself for the moment. They rode back in the late afternoon, the sun dropping west and throwing long gold across the valley. At some point, Hawthorne put his horse into a faster pace ahead of them, attending to something or creating an occasion. With Hawthorne, it was always hard to know which, and probably it was both. Elias and Lydia rode the last mile at a walk, Dunn and her sorrel mare moving at the same easy pace side by side. "You shook his hand before you knew all the terms," she said. "I know his word," Elias said. "The terms will be fair." "That's a lot of trust for a man who spent 7 months testing you." "He tested me because he's careful. Careful people are worth trusting once they decide to trust you." She was quiet for a moment, the horses walking, the grass moving in a light wind off the mountains. "He cried," she said, "when he told me about my mother and the man before him. He's only told me that story once, and he cried while he told it. My father, who I have never in my life seen show anything that could be called weakness." She looked straight ahead at the road. "And then last March he told a man he'd known for 6 months. A young man with $14. She glanced at him. "I think that tells you something about what he thinks of you." Elias didn't speak for a moment. The weight of that settled on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "He didn't cry when he told me," he said. "No, but he told you." She looked at him directly now, and there was something open in her face that he'd seen glimpses of in letters, but not fully, not like this. "That's the same thing." They reached the ranch yard. Hawthorne was already dismounted, talking to Olson. Margaret was visible through the kitchen window. The ordinary machinery of the household running forward the way it always did, unconcerned with the things that had shifted in the afternoon. Elias dismounted. Lydia stayed on her mare for a moment, looking down at him from the height of the saddle. "I want to say something," she said. "Say it. I was watching you this afternoon. On the land. The way you wrote it." She was choosing words carefully, in the way she did when what she was saying mattered enough to say right. "You weren't looking at what you wanted it to be. You were looking at what it was." She paused. "I think that's how you look at everything, people included." "I try to," he said. "I know." She looked at him a moment longer. I'm fairly sure, that I want someone like that. In my life." She said it clearly, without drama, which was more affecting than drama would have been. "Not as a declaration, just so you know where I am." "I know where I am too," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. She swung down from the mare. They were standing a few feet apart in the Hawthorne yard in the May afternoon, the mountains behind everything, the light going gold and long. "Come to supper Sunday," she said. "Same as always." "Same as always," he agreed. She took her mare toward the barn, and Elias stood there for a moment before going to see to Dunn, who was patient about waiting but had opinions about it. That evening, riding back toward Harlow Creek, where he'd arranged a room for the night at the boarding house, he took stock of his situation with the honest accounting that was the only kind he knew how to do. He had $14. He had a handshake agreement on 400 acres of good land. He had the work of the winter behind him, which had produced nothing that could be held in the hand, but everything that could be held to account. He had the knowledge of what he was made of, tested properly. And he had Lydia Hawthorne telling him plainly where she stood, which was the most valuable thing that had happened to him since October and possibly longer. He was 23 years old, broke as he'd ever been, and for the first time in his life he understood what his father had tried to tell him once, when he was young enough that the words hadn't made sense yet. His father had said that a man's real net worth wasn't what he had but what he'd done, and what he was prepared to do. And whether the people who knew him well thought both of those things added up to something. He'd thought that was the kind of thing fathers said, because they were supposed to say things. He understood now that his father had been attempting to give him the most practical information he possessed. The boarding house in Harlow Creek took him in for $1 a night, and he ate supper at the small table in his room. Bread and cold beef and an apple that had seen better days, and wrote in the worn notebook he'd been keeping since October. Not a diary exactly, just a record of what the land looked like and what the work had been and what he'd noticed about the way things worked when you paid attention to them. He wrote about the east section, about the drainage problem and what it would take to fix it, about the grass flat and the ridge shelter and the creek access. He wrote, "I know what I'm going to do with this land. I don't know yet if I can do it, but I know what it should be, and I know how to work toward it, and I have a place to start." That's more than I had in October. Then he closed the notebook and sat for a while in the lamplight, listening to the sounds of the small town settling into its evening, a horse somewhere, voices from the street below, the particular quiet of a place going to sleep. In 2 days, he'd start the work of figuring out what capital he could raise and how. In a week, he'd have the written terms from Hawthorne and could start planning the first season in earnest. There was a long road in front of him, uneven and uncertain the way all roads worth traveling were. He blew out the lamp. He slept without difficulty, which was something he'd earned. The written terms came on a Thursday, delivered by Olson in the usual wordless fashion. Envelope, hat tip, gone. Elias read them at the table in his boarding house room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was working through the language, which was precise in the way that Arthur Hawthorne was precise about everything that mattered to him. The agreement was fair, more than fair, in the places where fair had room to be generous without announcing itself as generosity. The drainage work and fence repair counted against the first season's rent at a rate Elias thought was reasonable. The cash lease after that was market rate, as agreed. There was a clause about land condition. Hawthorne expected the property returned in better shape than given, which was the kind of expectation Elias had no argument with. There was another clause about water access that protected both parties without favoring either. He read it twice, found nothing that made him uneasy, and wrote back the same day with 2 minor clarifications, one about the timeline for the drainage work, one about what happened if a bad summer drought stunted the grass recovery. Hawthorne's response came back in 3 days with both clarifications accepted and one small addition of his own about the east fence specification, which was also reasonable. They signed the final agreement on a Tuesday morning at the oak table in the Hawthorne house, Margaret as witness, the whole thing accomplished in under an hour. Hawthorne signed with the deliberate pen stroke of a man who meant what he put his name to. Elias signed the same way. They shook hands. "Don't make me regret it," Hawthorne said, and it wasn't a warning so much as the statement of a man who had already decided he wouldn't. "I won't," Elias said. That was the extent of the ceremony. He had 400 acres, a debt structure he understood, and approximately 6 weeks before the grass was at the height where he needed cattle on it, or it would go to waste. 6 weeks to raise enough capital to buy a starter herd, get what equipment he couldn't borrow, and have some margin left over for the 10 things he couldn't predict that would happen anyway. The $14 was not going to accomplish this. He spent the first week writing to every man in Harlow Creek and the surrounding range who had cattle to sell and a reason they might sell them at a price he could reach. He was direct about his situation, which some people found refreshing and others found concerning. He was 23, broke, and leasing land on the strength of a handshake reputation and a signed agreement with Arthur Hawthorne. That last part carried more weight than anything else, because Hawthorne's name in that county was a kind of currency. Frank Collis at the Ridgemont Supply Store, the same man who'd told Hawthorne about the $3 in change, gave him credit on supplies without being asked, just told him to settle up when he had cattle selling. An older rancher named Pete Sundberg, who was reducing his herd for reasons of age and a bad knee that made the work harder than it used to be, sold Elias 22 head of good mixed cattle at a price that was $2 below what the market would have borne. And when Elias pointed this out, Sundberg told him to shut up and take the cattle. I heard about the Grayson winter, Sundberg said, writing up the sale at his kitchen table. I heard what you did and what you didn't do. I did what I said I'd do, Elias said. That's what I mean. Sundberg didn't look up from the paper. It's rarer than it ought to be. By the end of May, he had 22 cattle on the east section, the beginnings of a working arrangement with Collis for supplies, and a debt load that was manageable if the summer went reasonably well, and alarming if it didn't. He also had blisters from the drainage work, a pulled muscle in his back from 3 days of fence post driving, and a sunburn that Lydia, when she saw him on Sunday, observed with more amusement than sympathy. You look like a cooked lobster, she said. That's what happens when you spend 2 weeks digging drainage ditches in May. Did you wear your hat? Mostly. Mostly, she repeated, with the tone of a woman storing information for future reference. She handed him a tin of something from the kitchen. Margaret's remedy. It smells terrible, but it works. It did smell terrible. It also worked. The summer arrived properly in June, and with it the particular rhythm of range work. Early mornings, long days, the kind of physical exhaustion at the end of them that left no room for anything but sleep. Elias moved through it the way he moved through most things, steadily, without theatrical complaint, keeping his attention on what the land was telling him and adjusting accordingly. The drainage work paid off faster than he'd expected. The south section, which had been sitting wet through most of the previous springs, according to Hawthorne, dried out enough by late June to carry cattle without wrecking the soil. The grass responded. He'd known good grass when he assessed the land, and good grass managed right was one of those things in ranching that compounded like interest. It got better when you did right by it, worse when you didn't, and the difference between the two added up over seasons into something you could see. He was not alone in the work, which was a thing he hadn't entirely planned on. Daniel Grayson rode over twice in June, once to return a tool he'd borrowed in the spring, and once apparently just to see how things were going. The second time he stayed half a day and helped Elias work a section of fence that genuinely needed 2 men to do right, and they worked the way they'd worked all winter, without a lot of unnecessary talking, each knowing what the other needed before it had to be said. Riding back toward the Grayson place in the late afternoon, Daniel stopped at the edge of the east section and looked out at what Elias had done with the land. It's different already, he said, than when the Pedersons had it. Pedersons had it too long without attention, Elias said. Land notices when you're not paying attention. Daniel looked at him. You sound like you. What does that mean? It means... Daniel paused. You always say things like that, about the land, like it's a person. Elias thought about that. It's not a person, but it responds to how you treat it, which is close enough to matter. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then, I'm going to make it. The ranch. He said it not like a boast, but like something he decided and needed to say out loud once. I thought you should know that. I knew that in February, Elias said. February? Daniel repeated, and something crossed his face. The specific expression of a man being told the time he'd stopped doubting himself was visible to someone else before it was visible to him. I wasn't sure in February. I know. That's why I didn't say it then. Daniel shook his head slowly, almost smiling. Safe ride, Carter. He turned his horse north. Safe ride, Elias said. He watched him go and felt something that he didn't have a simple word for. Not pride exactly, because Daniel's work was Daniel's own. Satisfaction, maybe, at having been present for something that mattered. July brought heat and a dryness that made him nervous for 2 weeks until a run of afternoon thunderstorms came through and sorted the moisture situation. The cattle gained condition through the month in a way he could track almost visually. Animals that had looked adequate in May looked genuinely good by August, the kind of good that translated to weight at sale time. He kept his accounts in a small ledger, the same methodical nightly accounting he'd always kept. The numbers were improving, not fast, not dramatically, but in the steady directional way that was more reliable than fast. Lydia came to the east section for the first time in mid-July, on a weekday afternoon which was different from the Sunday supper arrangement. She rode out without announcing it, which was something she did, and he was replacing a gate latch on the south fence when she appeared. I wanted to see it, she said, by way of explanation. It's not much yet, he said. Show me what it's going to be. So he did. He walked her through it. Not what existed, but what he was building toward, where the additional shelter would go when he could afford the materials, how the water would move once the drainage project was fully complete. where he'd run the herd in winter to use the ridge windbreak most efficiently. He talked about it the way he'd written about the land in his notebook the night after seeing it, not what he wanted it to be, but what it actually was, and what that meant for what it could become. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. She asked 2 questions that went directly to the things he hadn't fully solved yet, which he appreciated more. "The winter water," she said. "If the creek runs low." "I know. I've been looking at where I can put a secondary stock tank on the north end. It's a next season problem, but I'm not ignoring it. Father had the same issue on the west section 10 years ago. He'll tell you how he solved it, if you ask." "I'll ask." She nodded, looking out at the grass flat, the late afternoon light going gold across it. She had her hat in her hand. She'd taken it off at some point without him noticing. And the wind moved in her hair, and she was looking at his land with the same complete attention she gave everything. And he stood next to her thinking that this was the thing he'd spent the winter working toward, and it was not what he'd imagined, which was to say it was better, more real, less like a picture, and more like an actual thing that had weight and texture and complications. "It's good land," she said. "It is. You knew that when you looked at it." "I hoped it when I looked at it," he said. "The knowing took longer." She looked at him. The directness in it was something he'd gotten used to over the months of letters and Sunday evenings and the slowly shortening distance between where they stood, but it still had the quality of making him want to be careful about what he said next. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I told you in May, in the yard." "So have I," he said. "And?" He looked at her. "And I think you know where I stand without me repeating it." "I do," she said, "but I'd like you to say it anyway." He was quiet for a moment, because he was not a man who said important things carelessly, and this was important. "I'm not in a position to offer you much right now," he said. "Not materially. I've got a leased section and some cattle and a debt I'm working down. By next spring, the numbers will look different. By the spring after that, better still." He paused. "That's the honest version of my situation." "I didn't ask about your situation," she said. "I know. I'm telling you anyway because you should know it." He held her gaze. "What I can tell you that isn't about money is that I meant every letter I sent you this winter, and the ones before that about the land, and I mean this one too." He stopped, tried again. "I want to build something here, and I want to build it with you alongside it. If you're..." He was usually better at talking than this. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said quietly. "I want to ask your father properly," he said, "before anything else. That's the right way to do it, and I'm going to do it right." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She laughed. Not the polite kind. The real kind, sudden and unguarded, the kind that he'd heard once at a harvest gathering nearly a year ago and that had gotten itself lodged somewhere in him permanently. "What?" he said. "My father," she said, getting hold of herself, "has been waiting for you to ask for approximately 2 months. He brought it up himself at supper 3 weeks ago. He said, and I am giving you the exact words. He said, 'I wonder what Carter's waiting for.'" She looked at him, still with the remnants of the laugh in her face. "My mother told him to be patient. He was not patient." Elias stared at her. "He said that." "He did." "Arthur Hawthorne said he was wondering what I was waiting for." "Yes." He thought about this. "I was trying to be in a better position first." "I know you were." Her expression settled into something warmer and more serious at the same time. "That's very like you. It's also..." She searched for the word unnecessary in this case. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the late July afternoon held them there on the east section of the Hawthorne lease, with the cattle moving on the grass flat behind them, and the mountains doing what they always did, which was be large and indifferent and magnificent. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. He asked Arthur Hawthorne on Sunday after supper, sitting at the oak table with the remains of the meal still present, and Margaret having found, as she always did at significant moments, a reason to be elsewhere in the house. The candles had burned down from dinner, and the main lamp gave the room a low, steady light. He said it plainly, because that was the only way he knew to say things that mattered. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'd like to marry your daughter. I don't have much yet, but I have more than I did, and I know what I'm building, and I'll keep building it. I'll treat her right. I'll be straight with her even when straight is harder than the alternative." He paused. "I think you know the kind of man I am by now. I think you probably knew before I did." Hawthorne was quiet. He looked at the table, then at Elias, and what was in his face was not the calculating assessment of a man deciding. It was something older and quieter than that. The face of someone who had already decided and was now simply sitting with what the decision felt like. "She want this?" he said. "You'd have to ask her, but I believe so." The old man nodded once, slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up. "I'm going to tell you what I told your father when he asked me a similar question about a similar matter a long time ago, that—" He stopped and recalibrated because the story had arrived in his throat before he'd checked whether it was the right one. "I'm going to tell you what I wish someone had told me." He paused. "Marriage is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of a longer test than the winter I gave you. The winter had a finish line. This doesn't." He held Elias's gaze. "Are you ready for a test that doesn't end?" "Yes," Elias said. "You answered that fast." "I've been thinking about it since October." Hawthorne was quiet for another moment. Then he reached across the table and offered his hand. "Yes," he said, simply. Elias shook it. Margaret came back from wherever she'd been with a kind of timing that suggested she hadn't been far, and when Hawthorne told her, her face did what faces did when they'd been hoping for something and gotten it. Not surprised, just open, the careful composure of daily life briefly set aside. She looked at Elias. "Welcome," she said, and the word was the whole sentence. Later, after the evening had wound down and Hawthorne had gone to see to something in the barn, his habitual exit when emotion had accumulated in a room beyond his comfortable level, Elias found Lydia on the front porch in the August dark. She was sitting on the steps with her arms around her knees, looking out at the yard where the stars were doing their Montana best, which was considerable. He sat down beside her. He said, "Yes," Elias said. "I know. I could hear from the kitchen. You were listening. Intently." She looked at him sideways. "You did well. The part about knowing what kind of man you are." He liked that. "I wasn't trying to perform it." "I know. That's why he liked it." She leaned her shoulder briefly against his, which was the first time she had, and then straightened again and looked back at the stars. "Are you scared?" He thought about it honestly. "Of what specifically?" "Any of it. All of it." She paused. "I am. A little. What are you scared of?" She was quiet for a moment. "That I've made you into something in my head from the letters and the Sundays, and I don't actually know you." She said it without apology or drama, the way she said hard things. "That's a reasonable fear, I think." "It is," he said. "I have the same one." She turned and looked at him. "You do?" "I know who you are in letters and Sunday evenings. That's not nothing, but it's not everything either." She looked at him for a moment. "So what do we do with that?" "We keep going," he said. "We find out the rest as it comes. That's all anyone gets." She held his gaze, and then she nodded once, slowly, the way her father nodded when he'd received information that settled something. "All right," she said. They sat on the porch steps for a while after that, not saying much, the August night moving around them, the yard dark and the mountains darker against the sky, and the stars doing what they'd been doing long before any of this had happened and would keep doing long after. The cattle were on the east section. The grass was holding. The debt was moving in the right direction. The fence was standing. It was not a perfect situation. It never would be. But it was real, and it was his, and starting in the fall it would be theirs, and that was a word he was still getting used to carrying. Theirs. He turned it over in his mind on the ride home that night, the stars very bright, and done moving beneath him with the steady patience of an animal that had seen most of what a horse gets to see of human affairs, and remained, sensibly, unconcerned. The east section was dark when he got back. He put up the horse, checked the water trough out of habit, stood for a moment in the yard listening to the cattle settle in the dark. Then he went inside and lit the lamp and opened his ledger and wrote down the numbers from the week, the way he did every night. When he was done with the numbers, he sat for a moment with the pen in his hand. He wrote at the bottom of the page, August 17th, 1882. A. Hawthorne said yes. He closed the ledger, blew out the lamp. The night was clear and very quiet, and somewhere across the valley the Grayson Ranch was dark too. Daniel Grayson asleep after his own long day of work. The cattle healthy, the fences standing, the land in better hands than it had found itself in last October. And the Hawthorne Ranch was dark, and the mountains above everything were dark, and the stars were as indifferent and brilliant as they always were. Elias Carter, 23 years old, broke for most practical purposes, lay down on his bunk in the small house on the least east section, and was asleep in under 2 minutes. The work would be there in the morning. It always was. The wedding was in October. Not a grand affair. Neither of them wanted that, and Arthur Hawthorne's idea of ceremony was fundamentally practical, which meant the event was organized around the people who actually mattered rather than the appearance of mattering. The Harlow Creek Community Hall, decorated by Margaret and Lydia's cousin with whatever the season offered, which in Montana in October meant dried grasses and late wildflowers, and the kind of autumn color that didn't need help from anyone. About 40 people. A meal afterward that Margaret had been organizing for 3 weeks, and that was, by any honest assessment, better than the occasion required. Elias stood at the front of the hall in the only good coat he owned, which Lydia had inspected 2 days prior and pronounced acceptable with the specific tone of a woman who had decided to accept certain realities early. His boots were clean, his hair was cut. He had $19 in his pocket, which represented genuine financial progress from October of the previous year, and also, in the larger context of what was happening, felt entirely beside the point. He watched her walk toward him down the center of the hall, on her father's arm, and the thing he noticed first was not her dress or the way the light caught her hair, but the expression on her face. Calm, direct, entirely present, the same face she'd turned on him across 100 letters and a dozen Sunday suppers, and one February afternoon on a frozen rise. The face of a person who looked at things as they were and made her decisions accordingly. He thought, I have been lucky in the specific way that only looks like luck from the outside. Arthur Hawthorne placed her hand in Elias's with the gravity of a man who understood what he was doing and had made his peace with it, which was not the same as finding it easy. His eyes, when they met Elias's, said several things in the compressed language of men who didn't speak their feelings out loud. I trust you. Don't make me wrong. She's the best thing I've built. Elias held his gaze and nodded once. They said what they'd come to say. Simple words. The kind that had been said so many times they'd worn down to their essential meaning. He meant every syllable of his. He believed she meant every syllable of hers. That was the whole of what either of them could offer, and it was enough. Because enough was the honest standard and the only one that lasted. Daniel Grayson was there, sitting in the third row, clean-shaven and wearing a coat that fit him better than anything he'd owned when they'd first met. He caught Elias's eye at some point during the proceedings and gave a small nod, the nod of a man who understood what this had cost and what it had produced and thought both were right. Pete Sundberg was there too, sitting beside Frank Collis. 2 men who had extended trust to Elias when trust was the only currency he had to offer, who had bet on his word the way Hawthorne had bet on it, in their smaller ways, and been right. Margaret Hawthorne cried, which surprised nobody. Hawthorne did not cry, which also surprised nobody, though if you watched him carefully during the vows, there was a particular stillness in his face that was the place where some men kept the things they wouldn't show. After the ceremony, after the meal, after the toasts and the conversations and the gradual thinning of the gathering as people headed home in the October dark, Elias and Lydia stood together in the emptying hall, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been talking to each other for a year and had figured out that the silence between them was also good. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. She lifted her head and looked at him. Are you ready? For which part? All of it, she said. Same question she'd asked on the porch in August. The same honest answer applied. Working on it, he said. She laughed, the real kind. The first winter of their marriage was hard, in the specific way that first winters always were. Not catastrophically, not in the way the Grayson winter had been hard, but in the accumulating way of 2 people discovering exactly who they were to each other when the days were short and the work was relentless and there was no audience to perform anything for. They discovered, for instance, that Lydia had opinions about how the account ledger should be organized that differed substantially from Elias's existing system, and that she was right about this, and that Elias took 3 weeks longer than he should have to admit it. They discovered that he was not easy to read when he was worried, that he went quiet in a way that she initially interpreted as distant until she understood it was actually the opposite, that he went quiet because he was taking the worry seriously and working on it, and that what he needed in those moments was not space but just her presence, which she learned to give without requiring him to ask for it. They discovered that she was worse in the mornings than she had ever let on in the context of Sunday suppers, and that he didn't mind, which surprised her. They discovered that he had a temper that rarely came out, but when it did came out fully and without warning, usually in response to specific kinds of injustice or carelessness rather than anything directed at her, and that she handled it by going quiet herself and waiting, which turned out to be exactly right. They discovered that she was funnier than anyone outside her family had known, because she'd never had occasion to be funny in front of people who would simply let it be funny instead of being surprised by it. None of these were small discoveries. None of them were easy. But they were real, and real was what they'd both signed up for. The East section produced well that first year. Not spectacularly. Elias was too honest an accountant to call it spectacular, and the summer had a dry stretch in August that cost him some of the grass growth he'd been counting on. But solidly. The cattle went to fall sale in good condition, and the numbers landed above what he'd projected, which he attributed less to brilliance than to the drainage work paying off in the grass quality, and the grass quality paying off in the cattle's condition. The chain of right decisions, compounding. He made his first lease payment to Hawthorne in full and on time. He handed it over on a Sunday in November, folded inside an envelope, and Hawthorne took it and put it in his coat pocket without counting it, which was a statement about trust that Elias felt more than any words would have conveyed. "East section looks good," Hawthorne said. They were standing on the porch of the main house, the November cold, sharp, and clean. "It's getting there," Elias said. "Cattle looked right at the sale. Pete Sundberg thought so too. He asked if I had more to sell." Hawthorne's eyebrows moved. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to come back in the fall." The old man looked at him, and there was something in it. Not pride, because Hawthorne didn't do pride in the obvious way, but something adjacent to it. Satisfaction, maybe, at a calculation that had come out right. "You're thinking about expanding," he said. "Next year, if the winter's reasonable." "It won't be." "It never is." Hawthorne almost smiled. They stood on the porch for another moment in the cold, looking out at land that had been in the family for 30 years, that Hawthorne had built from nothing when nothing was genuinely what he had, the way that Elias was building from nothing now. "You know what I got wrong about you?" Hawthorne said. Elias looked at him. "I thought the tests would tell me whether you'd quit," Hawthorne said. "I was looking for the absence of a bad quality. Whether you'd run when things got hard." He paused. "What I didn't expect was that you'd care. About the Grayson boy. About the land. About doing the thing right, even when right was more complicated than necessary." He shook his head slightly. "That's not the absence of a bad quality. That's a different thing entirely." Elias thought about that. "I don't know how to do things halfway," he said. "It's not a virtue. It's just how I'm put together." "That's what makes it a virtue," Hawthorne said. They went inside to supper, which was what they always did. Spring came, and with it the second calving season on the East section, which Lydia participated in to a degree that Elias had not anticipated, and that impressed him considerably. She was not sentimental about it. She was practical, competent, willing to be up at 2 in the morning and covered in mud without complaint, and she had a specific quality with distressed animals that he'd never seen before, a calm that communicated itself to them in some way that was beyond his ability to produce. He told her so. "My father let me in the barn for calving when I was 8, she said, washing her hands after a long night. "Most fathers wouldn't have." "Smart man," Elias said. "He had his reasons," she said, but she said it with the warmth she always had when she talked about her father, which was the warmth of someone who had spent years being frustrated by a person and had arrived, eventually, at a clear-eyed appreciation of what that person actually was. That spring, a letter came from Daniel Grayson, brief in the way that Daniel's letters always were, saying that he'd gotten through the winter with all his cattle and was expanding the herd by 12 head and had hired a hand for the busy season, and that the east fence Elias had helped him rebuild was still standing and had survived 2 hard storms with no trouble. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller writing that looked like it had been added after the main part, I think about what you said about promises, the first kind and the second kind. I think I understand it better now than I did when you said it. Elias read that line twice, then put the letter in the drawer where he kept the ones that mattered and went back to work. By the second autumn, the east section was producing well enough that Elias raised the question of additional land with Hawthorne, not as a request, as a conversation. There was a parcel adjacent to the east section's north boundary that had been sitting idle, owned by a man in Billings who'd bought it speculatively and never developed it. Elias had done the research, knew what the man was asking, thought the price was 10% high but negotiable. He laid it out at the oak table one Sunday evening. The numbers, the reasoning, the risks, the potential. Hawthorne listened without interrupting. When Elias was done, the old man was quiet for a moment. "The Billings man is asking too much," Hawthorne said. "I know. I think he'll take 15% less. Offer him 12% less and let him talk you down to 15. Elias looked at him. "You've done business with him." "I have." Hawthorne's mouth moved. "He likes to win. Give him the room to feel like he won." The negotiation went almost exactly as Hawthorne predicted. Elias came home from Billings with an agreement on the parcel at 13% below asking price, which he considered a reasonable outcome for a morning's work. Lydia was in the kitchen when he got back, doing something with accounts at the table, which was her domain now by mutual and sensible agreement. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she'd learned to read it. "You got it," she said. 13% under. Father said 12. He was close. She looked at him for a moment and then she smiled. Not the laugh, but the smaller thing that lived near it, the one he'd come to understand was actually the more valuable of the two because it wasn't something she gave everyone. "Come eat something," she said. "You look like you haven't stopped since sunrise." "I haven't." "That's what I thought." He sat down at the table across from her accounts and ate the food she put in front of him, and they talked through the north parcel numbers while they ate, her asking the questions that went to the places he hadn't fully solved yet, him working through the answers out loud in the way he could with her, the two of them doing the thing that they'd built over the course of a year and a half of actual marriage, which was thinking together. This was not something he'd known to want until he had it. He'd thought, before all of this, that he was fundamentally solitary, that his quietness and his preference for working things through in his own head meant he was the kind of man who operated alone. He'd been wrong. He was the kind of man who needed exactly one person who could be trusted entirely, and he'd found her. And what he did with her present was better than what he did alone. That was the plain truth of it. There were hard days. He wanted to say so plainly because the hard days were part of what was real, and leaving them out would be dishonest. There were days when the numbers didn't work the way he needed them to, and the worry sat on him like a physical weight. Days when the weather did something he hadn't planned for, and he made a wrong call, and the wrong call cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. Days when he and Lydia were sharp with each other for reasons that had more to do with exhaustion than anything either of them had actually done wrong, and they both knew it and said so and worked through it, but it still cost something to work through. There were days when he missed being a simpler man with simpler responsibilities, which he recognized as the particular nostalgia of someone who'd chosen a harder life, and occasionally had doubts about the choice. The doubts didn't last, but they visited. He thought on those days about the Grayson winter, about the specific quality of that particular difficulty, the cold and the cattle and Daniels. What do we start with every morning, and the letters from Lydia that were his only warmth, and the Billings offer he'd turned down in January. He thought about what it had felt like to do the hard thing, without any guarantee that the hard thing was going to produce anything worth the doing. The memory of it was steadying in a way he hadn't anticipated, not because it made the current difficulty feel small. It didn't, necessarily, but because it reminded him that he'd been through something harder and come out the other side knowing what he was made of. That knowledge didn't expire. You didn't spend it. You carried it forward into every subsequent difficulty as evidence that the difficulty was survivable. He thought that was probably the most valuable thing the winter had given him. Not the lease agreement, not the handshake with Hawthorne, not even Lydia's "I think about you more than I should" in a letter at Christmas. Those were gifts. But the knowledge of his own capacity, tested cold and paid for hard, that was something he'd built himself, from the inside out, and it belonged to him in a way that nothing given could. One evening, in the autumn of the second year, he and Arthur Hawthorne were doing what they'd started doing occasionally, riding the boundary between their two operations together, the way neighboring ranchers did when they were checking on things, and also, without saying so, checking on each other. The light was going, the mountains doing their October performance with the last of the day's color. Hawthorne said, out of what seemed like silence, but was probably the continuation of something he'd been thinking about for a while. I've been meaning to ask you something. Ask it, Elias said. The morning you came to my porch. October of last year. Hawthorne was looking at the mountains. You knew the odds. You knew what I had and what you didn't have. You knew what the valley thought about a broke hand asking for a rancher's daughter. He paused. What made you do it? Elias thought about it. He thought about it the way he thought about real questions, not looking for the answer that sounded right, but for the one that was. I was more afraid of not asking than of being told no, he said. I figured I could survive a no. I wasn't sure I could survive wondering. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment. That's the whole thing, isn't it? He said. Not a question, just recognition. I think so, Elias said. They rode the rest of the boundary in silence, which was comfortable in the way that silence between two men who have built trust over time always was. Not empty, not awkward, just the natural form that some conversations took when they'd arrived somewhere true. At the boundary gate, Hawthorne pulled up. You're going to be all right, he said. You know that. I think so, Elias said again. Don't think so. Know it. The old man looked at him with the directness he reserved for the things he meant completely. I've been watching men work land in this valley for 30 years. I know the difference between men who are trying and men who are building. You're building. He paused. Lydia's building with you. That's a rare thing. Elias held his gaze. Thank you, he said. For the winter. For all of it. Hawthorne nodded once. Don't thank me, he said. You did the winter. I just gave you the occasion. He turned his horse back toward the main ranch. Elias watched him go for a moment, then turned east toward his own land, where the lamp was burning in the window and the cattle were settling in the dusk, and somewhere inside the house Lydia was at the table with the accounts or a book or a letter she was writing to someone, living the life they were building together one ordinary day at a time. He thought, riding home in the last of the October light, this is what I came for. Not the land, not the agreement. This, the ordinary weight of a real life, earned the long way. The north parcel went under his lease the following spring. The east section cattle sold well for the third year running. Daniel Grayson expanded the Grayson operation to 90 head and wrote to Elias to tell him so, in a letter that was still brief but had something in it, a confidence in its own voice, that hadn't been there in the beginning. And in the autumn of that third year, Lydia told Elias that they were going to need more room in the house come spring. He sat with that for a moment, at the kitchen table in the October evening, the lamp between them. More room, he repeated. A room, she said. Specifically. He looked at her across the table. She was watching him with the expression he knew by now, the one that was calm on the surface and had considerable depth underneath, the one she used when she'd said the important thing and was now waiting to see what he did with it. He thought about the morning he'd ridden up to Arthur Hawthorne's porch with $14 and a tired horse, and the specific kind of fear that comes from wanting something badly enough to do the foolish thing and ask for it. He thought about Daniel Grayson saying, "What do we start with in the cold dark of a Montana November?" He thought about Lydia's letter that said, "I think about you more than I should," and the way he'd folded it and carried it close to his chest through the rest of the winter. He thought about what the winter had taught him, which was not that hard things got easier, but that you got steadier, and steady was better than easy because easy didn't last and steady did. He reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll build it right," he said. She turned her hand and held his back. "I know," she said. "That's how we do everything." Outside, the October wind moved through the valley the same way it had moved through it the year before, and the year before that, and every year back further than anyone in Harlow Creek could remember. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. The grass on the east section was going brown and dormant for the winter, the way it did, the way it would come back in spring, the way it always did when you treated it right. The lamp burned between them at the table. The story that had started with $14 and one brave question on a rancher's porch had become this. Not a triumph with clean edges, but a life, complicated and real, built from the inside out by two people who had decided to look at things clearly and keep going anyway. That was the whole of it. That was enough. More than enough. It always had been.
All of our fucking insurance is gone! I'm pissed.
That was pretty funny.
Fuck this stupid chud game, man. Oh shit. I was scratching my face and I almost fell.
Searching on me or lights.
Oh, there was a mine right behind you.
Why the fuck is it so freaking stuffy in this building? I can't see a goddamn thing! Where was that landmine at? Ooh. Dude, where in the fuck am I? Oh.
Hello? There's a path on me, I think.
Path to what?
This dick.
I'm gonna
there's
blow
a mine.
myself
This
up.
is all dead end, I
Oh,
think.
careful, there's a mine. I don't know where
This is
to go.
all dead ends, I think. Yeah, it is.